Hi, and welcome to PHQ, Questions from the Personality Hacker Community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And let's get right to our question this week.
One of the most sadly neglected elements regarding Jungian personality theory is the relationship between the components that make a function pair. No sensation user could choose a carriage that did not make room for his perspective's dependent partner, nor could the extroverted thinker do without her introverted feeler. For all the superficial similarities the INTJ may share with the 7 other intuitive thinkers, it is perhaps the ESFP that understands him more than any other, for within her lurks the exact same impulses that guide the INTJ. There is something essential that draws the NI and SE user to the same battlefield that the NE and SI user cannot enter, though they too have their own struggles that the NI and SE user cannot understand. I wish to know what are the characteristics of that essential struggle that draws all 4 pair functions to their respective war zones at the expense of all others. I look forward to hearing your insight on this matter.
Thank you for the question. Not just for the question, but how much time and effort you took in articulating it. It was a beautifully crafted question. What I hear you asking is what is the sandbox that each of the polarities, the cognitive function polarities, plays in that is unique to that polarity. Now, polarities would be it's basically that each of the cognitive functions doesn't live on its own. It's not an island. It is intrinsically attached to the other, to its other half, the other half of the polarity.
Think of two sides of the same coin, basically.
Yeah, or I sometimes like to think of it as, especially since in each personality type, we're going to have part of the polarity stronger for us. I think of it almost like a comet with a tail. Like the part of us that is our dominant or auxiliary process is going to be much bigger and stronger, but it's always going to have that sort of the I don't know, after effect or the glow of the tail attached intrinsically to, you know, the more powerful piece. So for anybody who hasn't really thought about the concept of polarities, the 4 polarities, there's 8 cognitive functions, and they are 2 sides of the same coin with 4 different polarities. So those 4 polarities would be introverted intuition, and the other half of the polarity is extroverted sensing. And every person who has one of these 2 cognitive functions in their cognitive function stack is going to have the other half of that polarity as an intrinsic part of who they are and their identity. It's going to create like an inferior or tertiary process. So it's introverted intuition, extroverted sensing, extroverted intuition, and introverted sensing. And then on the judging processes, it's extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, and then introverted feeling and extroverted thinking. So you might have to write that down, but if you're new to these, but basically these are there's nothing that is complete about each individual function until you understand its polarity opposites.
For example, let's say you're an INFJ. Just to give you an example of one type, you're going to lead, your driver process is going to be that introverted intuition process. We've nicknamed it perspectives. But because that's your driver, that means in the car model here at Personality Hacker, at the 3-year-old position or the inferior position is going to be the opposite of introverted intuition, which is extroverted sensing, or what we've nicknamed sensation. And those 2 are intrinsically linked. Anytime you see one in a personality, you're always going to see the other. It might just be in a different order.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, I mean, that's the question. The question was, or the assertion in the question was that the only person who really understands what it's like to be an INTJ is going to be an ESFP, because they have all the same functions in their car model or in their cognitive function stack, only in reverse order. And I would to some extent agree with that. I would. As an ENTP, I have noticed that there's an interesting relationship I have with ISFJs. And there's a little inner ISFJ living inside of me. And I always imagine for ISFJs, there's a little inner ENTP living inside of them. So I would agree with that. So what is the foundational focus or the sandbox that each of these polarities is living in? And we're going to give you our opinion. Like, this is 100% our opinion.
Based on experience, research, and teaching this for a long time.
Yeah, and just thinking about it a lot, because the concept of polarities has really come up for us in the last couple of years, I would say. As we did more coaching, we recognized just how much of an influence the opposite side of that polarity had on the individual.
Yeah, I would say at this point, I can't think of type without thinking of in terms of polarity. Like
Yeah.
it's automatic for me at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think of the functions as alone or separate. I only think of them in terms of polarities. So our opinion, the things that we have come up with based on doing lots of coaching and seeing the things that people are focused on, are that for the perceiving processes, the polarity in the perceiving processes of introverted intuition and extroverted sensing is a focus on the mind-body connection. So extroverted sensing is very kinesthetic. It's very in touch with the information that's coming at it from the outside world. And then on the other side of the coin is introverted intuition, which then takes that information and post-processes it and sees a subjective pattern forming inside of itself in its unconscious mind based on this sensory information that was taken in. But it's all based on the individual. It's all based on what is coming into the sensory inputs and then collated later or post-processed later to get a pattern result. And the reason why we say the mind-body connection is my observation has been that most people who have this as a polarity end up in some way being very interested in health, in fitness, in the relationship between spirituality and health. I have a lot of friends who are INJs that have entered the health and wellness industry because there was just this, they had to go about health differently. Maybe they had health problems themselves and they had to go about it differently. And then now they want to share their findings with other people. But there was just always like this interest in it. And the reverse is also true. I've seen a lot of, in fact, your brother's an ESFP. And I've noticed that for him, when he relates to his body, he's a bodybuilder, he'll use a lot of words like meditate on the muscle, right? Like he'll talk about, when you're doing your reps, meditate on how your muscle's feeling. And so there's this really interesting concept between the corporeal body and sort of the transcendent place and the relationship between the two. So my observation, and I'm sure that polarity does other things as well, but my observation has been the thing that roots or grounds the polarity, the sort of its primary sandbox, is the mind-body connection. And then the other perceiving polarity would be extroverted intuition and introverted sensing, which for me doesn't really feel like it lives in the individual, like sort of the difference between the mind-body connection of NISE. I'll just use the shorthand of NISE. It feels like this is more about what's going on in the outside world. So introverted sensing is about... to some extent, it's really about creating protocols and about making sure that we do things based on how we know that they've happened before and preserving what we've seen before and turning it into a standard. And so when it comes to SI or introverted sensing, the reason why a lot of people who have this process are traditionalists is because there's no reason to rock the boat if you don't have to, right? Like let's go based on what has worked, what we've seen before, and why create the novel if we don't need to, if something's been working this entire time. Extroverted intuition is about novelty and exploring new ground and creating something new out of what we've already had in the past. And so to some extent, it's the push-pull relationship. It's the tension between standards and breaking new ground. And we have to have that tension, just like, NI and SE, introverted intuition and extroverted sensing, has to have the tension between the mind-body connection, because we are both at the same time. We are also both standards in the outside world, in the infrastructural world. We are both standards and we're newness. We're preventing ourselves from stagnating. And we want creativity. We've got to go to the next, whatever the next technology is. If we're not adapting and we're not going to the next technology, then, the animals that did not adapt were the ones who ultimately stopped existing. But at the same time, if we're always in novelty and if we're always creating newness, then we don't ever get a foothold. We can't actually ever root ourselves. And so adapting too fast indicates that we're actually probably also going to lose our lives, because there's nothing to, really create any sort of standard for survival and like really create those deep roots. So it feels to me that the sandbox of NE and SI is more infrastructural in the outside world. it's less about us as like our attachment to our mind body connection, and more like our attachment with the world around us. It's more of our, basically that we are an object in nature, whereas the NISE is more like we're a subject, we are an individual, and nature sees us as an individual. I guess this is probably not exactly what you're asking for, but I think of when I think of the Simone de Beauvoir's essay on the ethics of ambiguity. She talked about how we are both a subject and an object in nature, and it's the tension between the two that really defines our sense of ethics and what we are. We're both, she calls that the ambiguity. I would say the NINSE is very attached to the subjective nature of where we're at in that ambiguity, and SINE is more of like the object piece of where we're at in that ambiguity. So we have a relationship both with who we are as individuals in the self, and then also the terrain outside of ourselves. And it's just two different focuses. And so that's what I've come up with when I see the polarities of the perceiving processes.
One of the perspectives I have is that the perceiving processes live in different, they embody different, or they experience time differently. So I see the NISE, the perspectives sensation polarity, introverted intuition and extroverted sensing, as a linear process, right? I see it much more because it's about the here and now, the body-mind connection. It's all about the movement through actual time and space. Think in terms of time and space being linked in a sense. It's about linear way of perceiving the world. And you might not think that as an extroverted sensing person. You might not think you do things linearly because you're reacting to real-time environmental things, or you're responding to the stimuli coming into you. But you're doing that in real time often, and real time is linear. Like actual time that we live in is linear. You're not doing that outside the bounds of time. So I see both of these perceiving processes in this polarity as linear. When I shift over to SI and NE, so introverted sensing, we've nicknamed memory, and extroverted intuition, which we've nicknamed exploration, this polarity I see as much more like a CD-ROM. Back in the old days, a long time ago, you had CDs, and we have a lot of random access now in our lives, but there's a big difference when we went from tapes, linear tapes, listening to music, to a CD where you could access the track you want right now. And I see this perceiving process, NESI, as much more nonlinear, much more fragmented, much more random access. It doesn't have to be in the here and now time to be able to be used. And if you're leading with that introverted sensing, you can access the impressions inside yourself, or the memories inside yourself, almost as if they're happening right now, because it's not linear for you. They come up for you as if they're real right now in the moment. You look at a photo of a Thanksgiving 10 years ago, and all of a sudden you're flooded with all these memories that feel just as real at the time you had that holiday, for example. And obviously exploration, or NE, or extroverted intuition, those are three names for the same process. I'm giving you all the names we use here. That also is random access. You're throwing together concepts that are seemingly unrelated, and you're making connections between them in a nonlinear, random access fashion. So I see the NISE polarity as in time and linear, and I see the NESI polarity as random access and nonlinear.
You're right. And that might be a little bit of a different way of looking at it for a lot of people, because SI is attached to, it's generally, not generally, if you have introverted sensing as either a dominant or auxiliary process, you're a judger. And if you have introverted intuition as a dominant or auxiliary process, you're a judger. So it would feel like those would both be in time. But I have to agree with you. I have to agree that NI and SE feel more like it's moving through time, or at least on a conscious level. Like you said, extroverted sensing is like in the moment, and we experience time linearly in the moment. Time just keeps going, and if we're always in the moment, we're experiencing like the next minute, which is a linear progression. Whereas introverted sensing, when it takes that information in and then also post-processes it, even though it's more focused on the past, it is focused on random access moments of the past, or its impressions of the past. And so, like you said, you can just call that minute, that moment up. Now, both SI and NI are attached to judging processes that are going to feel more linear. And NE and SE are attached to judging processes that are subjective or introverted, so they're going to feel less linear. But I would agree with you. I would say that NI and SE feel more in time, and NE and SI feel more out of time. And that's not to indicate that the people who are using it are necessarily out of time. SIs are very good at, say, scheduling, and they're very good at creating a schedule, and they're very good at like following schedules and understanding linear progression of time. We're not trying to indicate that they're not, but the polarity itself seems to have sort of an edge to it that is sort of out of time.
When they're perceiving the world,
yes,
this is how it's going to work.
Yes,
Because when a SI dominant person or an SI auxiliary person is using that memory process to perceive their world, they're engaging with a new piece of information or content, and they're reconciling that based on past impressions, which they randomly access to reconcile with the world at hand. So this is what's happening. It's very random access to compare and contrast. That's why precedent is so important. They can reference back to these reference experiences, pull them up in real time, random access wise, and apply them to that new situation.
yeah, and the thing that keeps somebody who's using SI, which would be an SJ in the Myers-Briggs system, that the thing that's keeping them linear is not their perceiving process. It is their decision-making process. So I would agree with that. I would agree that their expression of time is also focused on something slightly different. So let's talk about the judging processes then. So let's take first, I'll use mine and you can do yours if you want to. I'm an ENTP, so I'm using introverted thinking, and then extroverted feeling would be the polarity opposite. And we call those accuracy and harmony. But I'm just going to refer to them on the cognitive function, the technical name. Because I'm assuming if you got this far into the podcast, you're probably into the technical aspect of cognitive functions.
Yeah.
So my impression of the thing that introverted thinking and extroverted feeling, or TI and FE, are most focused on, or what is true. Because introverted thinking is very much about it's about truth separate from what we want to be truth. Give me the data points, and then I will make sense of them. I will determine what makes the most sense. And it doesn't have to play out in any way in the outside world. When something, for me as TI, when something strikes me as true, I don't really care if it plays out in the outside world and has definitive markers of playing out in the outside world. It's more about what makes analytical and logical sense to me. And so if it doesn't play out in the outside world, my assumption is that we're just not at a place where it can play out yet. Like the technology of the world has not caught up with the information and like the thing that makes sense. And then I feel compelled to represent that truth. Even if that truth is contradicting everything we know about the world, I still feel compelled to represent it as truth. Now, I recognize that the more I develop my TI process, the less I see definitive truths around me. And so the less I'm representing the truths that I feel are subjective truths to me, the less I feel like they're like definitive truths for everybody else. But I'm still moving through the world as if certain things make the most sense, and that is how things should be playing out. And my observation has been that extroverted feeling, or FE, is also focused on truth. It's just focused on social truths. One of the first things that two extroverted feeling people do when they meet each other is they start establishing unspoken social contracts. And when I say unspoken social contracts, they do it through conversation. They just don't necessarily address the social contract itself. This is why for extroverted feeling, gossip is so intriguing. And I don't mean it in a negative way. Gossip is one of the foundational components of all societies. And what gossip is basically doing as two people are gossiping is that they're creating a narrative or story around a third party to ensure that the two people talking about that third party are actually on board with each other's social contracts. So if somebody says, oh, hey, did you hear about so-and-so doing this thing? And the other person's like, yeah, I think it's wonderful. Or they say, yeah, I would never do that, right? Or basically like, oh, that's a terrible thing for that person to do. What those two people are doing when they're talking to each other is they're effectively saying, that's the kind of behavior that I think we should be moving toward as a society, and I will move towards that behavior. And the other person goes, yes, I agree. I also think that that's appropriate behavior. Or conversely, if they're talking negatively about a third party, that person is saying, I don't believe that that is an acceptable way of humans behaving. I'm letting you know that I don't feel that that's okay to behave that way, so I won't be doing that. And the other person says, yes, I agree. Like, that's a bad way of behaving, so I won't be behaving that way either. And then they create a contract with each other of the kind of behavior that they think is acceptable. But really what that is it's a social truth. There are certain ways that people should be behaving and other ways that they shouldn't. But really, the behavior is just feeding into this concept of what is true for people. And that's why there are certain quote unquote truths that get adopted by whole societies that are actually unhealthy for society, because they're being vetted through contracts as opposed to analytical truth. And that's one of the reasons why I think that TI is so necessary, is because if there is a social truth that is actually damaging society, it's really good for TI to come in there and go, okay, guys, I know that we've created all these social contracts around this and that this is the accepted truth, but that's not accurate. And so we're going to have to slice through that. And conversely, if you've got too much analytical truth without social truths, we don't really know how we should be behaving towards each other. We actually end up being very hostile to each other. And those social truths are what help keep us in harmony, right? They help keep us from constant conflict. So both sides are imperative, but what they're really focused in on is the truth. What is accurate? What is social? What is the ultimate truth that we're going to be believing?
So if TI is interested in truth, introverted thinking, let's look at the other polarity, which starts with extroverted thinking. So the other thinking process, but it's extroverted, which we've nicknamed effectiveness. TE is focused on what are we going to do in the outside world? What is the action we're going to take? So whereas TI and FE might be focused on truth, data truth or social truth, TE is focused on action. What are we going to do? And then on the other side of that polarity is that FI, or that introverted feeling process as well. So let's just talk about TE first. Obviously, effectiveness, TE, is very interested in logical steps, step A through Z, to get to a result in the outside world. So obviously, these people are very good. This personality type, if you have this in your type, you're going to be really good at structuring things in the outside world, building things, making things happen, accomplishing tasks, project management, all of the external markers and steps that need to be taken and measurements to get something accomplished. Well, just like if there's too much data truth, you need that social truth to come in. If there's too much focus on accomplishing things in the outside world, you really need to have another part to come in and say, well, wait a minute, is this the should thing we should be doing? Like, as people, yeah, we can build that factory and dump battery acid into that river, but is that the kind of people we want to be? Is that how we should be doing these things in the outside world? And that's where this authenticity or introverted feeling FI process comes in. So there's a lot of things we can do in the outside world, but are we acknowledging the human experience? Are we taking people's individual ethics? Are we taking our ethics into account? And so I think what this polarity is focused on is, what do we do? And obviously the TE frame is going to be the actual doing of it, and the FI part of it's going to be more about who we are in the midst of doing that. So I think you could compare and contrast the two judging polarities, the two decision-making polarities. TIFE is interested in how we believe or think about things. TEFI is interested in about how we do things and how we show up honoring individuals.
So that doesn't mean that, a lot of times introverted feeling or FI is very much interested in belief and ethics and convictions. But that is
it's usually how it's applied somehow.
Exactly.
It's applicable.
Right. And, it might not feel that FE is that interested in truth or what we're believing, but really it is, because I think what it is TIFE. That polarity more thinks that if we're believing the right things, then we'll be doing the right actions. And the TEFI polarity more focuses on, if we're doing the right things, then we'll be the right kind of people.
We have to believe the right things to do the right things by default, almost.
Exactly, right. And so it's still interested in similar things. It's just which direction informs the other. And so TIFE focus on the belief part in order to have the right behavior, and TEFI focuses on the behavior part in order to have the right beliefs.
I would also say that as polarities, TIFE seems to be more collaborative, more lateral in nature in how it shows up, how people see each other connecting. And the FITE polarity seems to be more hierarchical. Like there's more structure, there's a lot more, top-down hierarchy thinking. Even in the FI, when you don't, an FI person is that artist type potentially that may seem like they're really outside the system, but they have some hierarchy of values or their own internal evaluative system. There's a hierarchy of morals or ethics they have that they go for. So I see these two polarities as hierarchy versus lateral as well.
And I think FIs resist hierarchies because they are so aware of them.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, you can't be over me, man. And it's like, well, but I mean, like for me, I don't even think of people as being over me. Like I don't resist the system because I'm not really thinking about the system. And so I think that sort of informs that that's something very intriguing to them or interesting, or at least something that's, on their minds. So as I guess is like a wrap up, too long didn't read. NISE feels like it's more about the mind-body connection, and SINE feels more about our relationship to the infrastructure around us and the world we're going to create around us. And TIFE feels more about like the truths we're going to believe in order to inform our behavior. And TEFI feels more about what we're going to do, their behavior, and what we're going to accomplish in order to show what kind of people we are or what we're going to fundamentally believe. And that seems to be sort of the focus. And again, these are based on our observations. These are, I would say actually one more thing before we wrap up. If a person is imbalanced or unhealthy, it's usually because they're not giving enough credit to the other side of the polarity. They're anchored way too much on one side. And one of the easiest ways to illustrate this is, say, the TE or the extroverted thinking dominant person not giving credence to their FI inferior value system. And so they do things that feel unethical. They do things that don't feel good in fact, they'll be quite exploitative to humanity because they're not really thinking in those terms. And that means that they are not honoring the other side of their polarity. And that's one of the easiest ways to exemplify that. But all of it, that rule holds true for all of it. If I'm way, way, way too attached to my concept of truth and I'm just telling people how it is and I'm hurting people doing that, that means I am not honoring my FE enough. I need to be making sure that I'm couching my quote unquote truths in a way that is honey and not vinegar, that is acceptable and connective and shows compassion to other people. And if I'm way too involved in my FE, if I'm thinking that everybody else needs to be, showing up the way that I think they should be showing up, and they need to be following all the rules, the social rules, then that means that I'm not giving enough credit to the things that are making sense to me, and whether or not I should be like sort of cutting through and saying that the emperor has no clothes on. And so it's just all of those play out. So make sure that in your own personal polarities that you are honoring the other side and understanding what it's fundamentally trying to do for you. It's creating a ballast to make sure that you're not too overweighted on one side and then ending up showing up not as your best self.
Yeah, thanks for the question. If you have your own question, head over to personalityhacker.com/questions. There's two ways to ask it. You can record your question using a little piece of software we have there on your mic, on your laptop, or your computer. And you can also write a question in to us. And we're going to answer these weekly. The PHQ show comes out once a week. And we keep getting more and more questions coming in. So if we don't get to your question right away, be patient. We'll get to it eventually, hopefully. But go ahead over to personalhacker.com/questions and ask your question there. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You've been listening to PHQ Questions from the Personality Hacker community. We'll talk with you on the next episode.